This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky, and we are watching Magnus Carlsen taking on Jan Nepomniachtchi at the FIDE World Rapid Blitz 2021. This is, of course, a rematch from the world champion. A lot on the line for these two players. Let's see if Nepo can deliver a little bit of revenge. And we have a King's Indian attack by Magnus, and Nepo adopting kind of a French defense setup. So Magnus generally, he's going to go knight bd2 and then e4, and that is a full-fledged defense against the French. Let's see how Nepo positions his pieces. He goes knight out to c6, which is a viable variation, and black often tries to go pawn e5 in this line. Even though he's already gone e6, even with a tempo down, this kind of setup can be good. And Magnus also delaying d4. What an interesting little opening here, and he prevents black from going e5. Now the knight on c6 looks pretty awkward because Nepo would love to push his c-pawn out to c5 and contest the center. This is kind of a weird Catalan type structure. Knight bd2, Nepo going b6, preparing to develop his light squared bishop, perhaps even out to a6. Because if the bishop goes out to b7, it's just going to be staring at the d5 pawn. Let's see if Magnus will go c4. No, Magnus going a little bit calmer, b3, fianchettoing his own bishop, and Nepo does decide to put it on b7. Knight swings to the side, knight a5. Nepo just doesn't seem happy. Not sure if it's because of his tournament standing or because of the opening, maybe because of the world championship. Let's see what Magnus does here. Now, Nepo almost certainly wants to push his c-pawn to c5. Magnus centralizes his knight to e5, tries to exploit the drawback of Nepo's last move, c5. Magnus trades immediately. Okay, and I think Magnus wants to follow up with c4, but Nepo takes with the bishop. I'm a little bit surprised. I thought he would take with a pawn and try to keep as big of a center as possible. And will Magnus still play c4? He does. c4 by Magnus. Now, Nepo could take that pawn because the bishop on b7 is going to be protected by the knight on a5. So if he takes, we will see a trade of light squared bishops. I'm not sure who that's good for. Nepo decides to keep the tension. Rook c8, rook c1. And once again, he has to decide. Does he take on d4? c4? Does he play pawn d4? Which is also possible. No, he still keeps the tension. Queen e7. Nepo wants to put his f-rook on d8, x-raying white's queen. White's queen doesn't have all that many good squares. If Magnus plays queen c2, then his queen walks from one x-ray right into another one. So this looks pretty decent for Nepo. Magnus also can't play a3 b4 because the queen on e7 and the bishop on c5 are forming a battery that's preventing a3. And Magnus decides to change the structure. cd5, bishop takes d5. Nepo offers a trade of bishops. Magnus, he wants to trade on his own terms. He brings the knight back to d3, giving a little bit more beef to that d-file. Now rook fd8 isn't going to be quite as annoying. Nepo trades on g2, so finally a trade of light squared bishops. Magnus is king, not the safest here, but the d2 knight could come over to f3 and provide a little bit more protection. There's really no attack on the cards. I think maybe white is a tiny bit better. Magnus has that really nice dark squared bishop that's on the long diagonal. His knights are well placed. The knight on d3 is perfectly centralized and hitting the bishop on c5. So maybe Nepo wants to bring that bishop back to d6. I don't know if Magnus wants to trade on c5 just yet. There's also the idea of going b3, b4 that Nepo has to be very, very careful about. It might not be possible now, but if that queen from e7 moves anywhere, b4 is going to be a really dangerous threat. Let's see if Nepo brings his bishop back. He can play bishop a3 and try to trade those bishops. Lots of choices for Nepo. Yeah, he brings it back to d6. And Magnus could trade a pair of rooks and perhaps go queen a1, building his own battery on the long diagonal. The knight on a5 also not very well placed, so maybe Nepo wants to bring it back to c6, back to the center. The position pretty symmetrical. White's bishop is slightly better placed. This is the kind of position that Magnus really likes, though. It's positional, it's calm, and he has the chance to put a lot of pressure. He knows how to create problems. Nepo, funny way that he moved that knight back to c6, preventing, or at least taking the sting out of knight e5. Let's see if Magnus can create chances here. Rook c4, getting that rook up. Now, he's creating space on the first rank for his queen. Maybe queen a1, maybe queen c1. I really, really like that move. Nepo could chase that rook away with b5, and he does. Where is Magnus going to bring him? Back to c2. So Magnus has induced the move to b5, and now he's got that c5 square, which perhaps later he can occupy with his knight. Nepo goes knight b4, trying to force more trades. Knight b4, bishop b4. More pieces are getting traded. Magnus hitting that pawn on b5 with queen d3. Now, will Nepo defend it with a6? He does. Magnus could get his f1 rook either to d1 or to c1. He puts it on c1. He tries to wrest control of the c-file from black. Nepo goes for the trade. What will Magnus take with? He takes with the queen. He keeps full control of the c-file. And guess what? He can go queen c6. That f3 knight could also swing to e5. This is a tiny bit unpleasant for Nepo as he tries to force as many trades as possible. Magnus taking on f6. What an interesting decision. So Magnus going for a knight versus bishop situation, which is not so uncommon in the Catalan, because that f3 knight could be really, really effective in accessing some of the weak squares in Black's territories, such as c6 or even d7. That knight can combine with the queen and the rook and cause a lot of problems on Black's queen side. What worries me about Nepo's position are those a6 and b5 pawns. They're really alone, and Magnus starts attacking them. There's queen c6. How is Nepo going to defend those pawns? He can't go rook a8. e5 looks really bad because of the queen trade, and then Black's kingside pawns are going to be ruined. This looks really unpleasant all of a sudden. How does Magnus do this? Maybe queen b2. Nepo has to create active counterplay. He goes e5. This endgame looks terrible. Knight h4, knight f5. Magnus gets his rook into d7. This is exactly the kind of position you don't want against the world champion. This is how he won a couple of games in the match against Nepo. He got better endgames. He squeezed them to a win. That knight on f3 is perfectly positioned. It can swing to h4 and then f5. And Nepo's bishop on a3 is totally futile at defending the queenside pawns because they're on light squares. That's the problem with only having one bishop. How is Nepo going to defend this? Will he go rook c8 and try to activate his own rook, or will he go into passive defense? Or will he go rook a8? Maybe a case to be made for that, trying to keep your pawns alive. He goes rook c8. That is Nepo's style. Magnus hunting for the pawns, and so is Nepo. Rook takes a6, b4, anchoring the bishop, and now Nepo's going to recapture at least one pawn. He's going to recapture at least the pawn on a2. Magnus makes sure that the e2 pawn is protected. Now he takes f6, but now white's a pawn up, and Black's whole king side is collapsing. So for Nepo, maybe he should go rook b2, try to give away all of those kingside pawns, but at least get a passed pawn of his own for some active counterplay. Definitely not objectively good, but he's got to do something. His entire king side is falling apart. H6, e5, f7, all of the pawns are weak, and Nepo, bishop c1, interesting move. He wants to play bishop takes e3. Nepo, no, not going gentle into that good knight, but Magnus continues to grab pawns. Knight takes e5, bishop takes e3, but knight g4 even. Knight g4 would win the pawn, or you could take on f7, and Magnus does. He's 2 pawns up. Nepo hasn't won a b3 pawn. Bishop to d4, attacking the knight. Rook back to f5, and if rook a5, there was knight g6 there. Rook b2, Nepo does go after the b3 pawn. Can Magnus defend it? He goes knight c6, hitting the bishop, bishop c3. No, he's going to lose that pawn. He's going to lose b3, and that's a great job by no, but rook f3, what a move! If rook takes b3, there was knight takes b4, and Magnus finds a tactical way to keep the b3 pawn protected. What an incredible construction. This is the world champion at his best, and Nepo has to move away from b2. And now Magnus can keep pushing his kingside pawns. He's got a huge majority there. Instead, he goes rook f4, and he attacks b4, and now Nepo can't defend it. Oh man, what incredible technique by the world champion. He's going to win b4, and now he's completely winning. He's 2 pawns up on the king side. That should be a pretty simple conversion. Nepo takes b3, but a little bit of work still required. Knight d5. That decision to trade bishop for knight was an incredible one. You can see the frustration in the way that Nepo is moving. Bishop d6. Magnus can combine knight e3, knight f5, and Nepo decides not to continue. He throws in the towel. What a game by the world champion. And if you like this video, feel free to click the link on the playlist for more of these videos. Thank you so much for watching.